All right, welcome back, and thanks for joining us at the SKYLIT Books Podcast. My name is Tyler Austin. I'm a bookseller and podcast host here at the SKYLIT Podcast. Today I'm going to be joined by Matt Singer. Matt Singer is the editor and film critic of ScreenCrush.com and a member of the New York Film Critics Circle. In 2011, he won a Webby Award for his work on the IFC News on the Independent Film Channel. He's the author of Marvel's Spider-Man, From Amazing to Spectacular, and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 daughters. Today we're discussing his latest book, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for talking to me.
So just kind of starting off, I obviously Siskel and Ebert are these figures who loom large in sort of the critical community. I would hope anybody listening is pretty familiar with them, but I was wondering if maybe just beyond the idea of 2 guys talking about movies, if you could sort of explain what their sort of innate appeal was and what it is that made them so special.
Well, they were these 2 Chicago newspaper critics who in the mid-1970s were put together on a TV show, the first of its kind, really, this movie review show on PBS in Chicago that was, these 2 guys kind of talking about, debating, often fighting about the movies in town. And I guess the appeal was exactly that. I mean, it was, on the one hand, at a time when there wasn't an internet, there wasn't an IMDb, there wasn't a YouTube, any of these places to get information about movies, to watch clips from movies. It was this place where you could go to get that stuff, because every week they would tell you what the new movies were coming out. They would show lots of clips from the movies. So there was that aspect of the show, especially in the beginning. And then there was Siskel and Ebert, the 2 guys, and they did have this amazing, weird dynamic that they did not like each other in real life, especially at the beginning and before they did the show. And they had this rivalry, this competition that existed, again, prior to the show, just from being rival critics at rival newspapers in Chicago. And they found a way to kind of translate that energy onto the show. And so the show combined being very informative, very useful from like a consumer standpoint of, I'm a movie lover and I live in some small town somewhere in the country, and this is a great way to find out what might be playing in my local theater or what might be coming eventually, and then later like what I could rent at the video store perhaps. And then it also had this dynamic of, these guys don't really seem to like each other and they're yelling at each other all the time, and it makes for really compelling television. And that was the reason to watch the show, or the reasons generally to watch the show. It was fun and it was really interesting, and it could really open your eyes if you were interested in movies. It absolutely was a great gateway to discovering movies and learning a lot, and certainly from my experience, it was a great way to learn a lot of not only about movies, but about movie criticism.
Well, and so you say right there at the end, I was sort of obviously, it's a lot of time and effort to research and write a book, years usually. So what was it about, these 2 guys and the impact that they had in the show that they had? What was the impact that it had on your life and that it inspired you enough to want to write this book?
Well, they had incalculable impact on my life. I mean, I certainly would not be here. I mean, obviously I wouldn't be here talking about the book if not for them, but I would not be a writer about movies, a film critic, anything like that, if not for the show. That was the thing that first made me interested really in all of this. I went to the movies like any other kid might. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and I would go to the movies and see whatever the new thing was at the multiplex, comedies and blockbusters and things like that. But I generally was not a hyper nerdy cinephile at a young age. I had other things that I was more interested in movies than in movies, frankly, like comic books, the New York Mets, all kinds of things. And movies was just kind of one part of it. It was maybe not even that big of a part of the equation at that age. And then I found this show, and it was the show that was, for me, again, I called it a gateway, and it really was. It was the thing that really sparked my interest in movies and movie criticism, and wanting to learn about them, wanting to watch more movies, wanting to read film criticism, wanting to eventually write about them, talk about them myself. That was, it all stemmed from this show for me. And like to consider what my life without the show is to consider a totally different life. It is, it's the sliding doors Gwyneth Paltrow thing. Like I would just be in a totally different place. I don't know where I would be. I don't know what I would be doing, but it would be something very different and probably a lot less interesting than this.
I think that speaks to, and we can touch on this again later, is that there's a lot of people with similar stories regarding Ebert and Siskel and what their impact was on them. But sorry, just quickly, I'm so sorry that you're a Mets fan. That's just terrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. It's a curse. It's a curse that I was bestowed by my father, who, he was originally a Dodgers fan and then became a Mets fan when the Dodgers left and then the Mets came in. But yeah, it's passed down from generation to generation, like some weird genetic predisposition to some horrible disease. And that I'm just cursed with being a Mets fan forever now. Thanks a lot, Dad. Love you, but really,
inherited trauma.
Couldn't have rooted for the Yankees. I mean, think about all the championships I could have celebrated in all these years that I've been alive. But anyway, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, as a Yankee fan and a dad who grew up in Flushing, was like, you know what? I don't like these Mets. I'm going to be a Yankee fan. I thank them all the time.
That was smart.
Not recently, but a lot usually. Anyways, we'll go. So you spoke a lot about in what their innate appeal was, is this dynamic. And I think you do a great job in the book of sort of, obviously, you kind of set up these dual narratives where it's these two guys who kind of on the surface have a lot in common. They have similar backgrounds. They have they're similar demographics. They're college educated. They become newspaper critics in the city of Chicago. And yet when you dig a little deeper, they have all these differences that they're both obviously very competitive with one another to begin with, but they have all these differences, and when you put them together, when they kind of crash into each other, that's what the sparks were that people came to see, even if they weren't necessarily interested in every movie they were viewing. And I guess I just wonder, was that always your choice in structuring it? Was that you're going to kind of start with each of them until they collided?
Yeah, I mean, I was very cognizant of the fact that I wanted the book to, as best as I could, be not too focused on one or the other, that I really wanted it to be an evenly balanced book. Obviously, Roger Ebert wrote a memoir. The memoir was then turned into a movie. So, and the memoir is great. And it'd be idiotic of me to try to compete with Roger Ebert on any level, much less trying to write about his life better than he did. So I also didn't want to make it, like the Roger Ebert story, but I also didn't want to make it the Gene Siskel story. That was sort of the tricky part, was there's less written about Gene, but if I made it too much about Gene, then that's no good either. And so I did try to balance it as best I could, make it as equally focused on each of them. I don't know that I ever got so demented about that I counted the pages or the words of their individual chapters where it's their lives before the show. But I certainly was aware of the fact that I did not want one of those chapters, and that, each one has a chapter in the beginning of the book that's about, their lives before the show and up to the show. I certainly was aware of, I don't want the Ebert chapter to be, I don't know, whatever it ended up being, 50,000 words, and then have the Siskel chapter be 10,000 words or vice versa. I really tried then and throughout the whole book to really make it the Siskel and Ebert book together and equally about each of them, if for no other reason than if it wasn't that way, and if one of, imagining them reading it somehow, if it was too much about one or the other, they would have not been happy. I could never hazard a guess what they would have thought of the book, but I know if the book had been tilted in one direction or the other, that would have been unacceptable, because they so much in life were focused on making sure things were not tilted in one direction, at least in their minds. So yes, I was very vigilant and focused on, when I structured the book, making it an equal book about the two of them equally as best as I possibly could.
That's very smart, because these seemed like guys who, even in the afterlife, you would not want to upset their barometer of fairness.
No.
Just based on some of the great stories you have in the book about how, the lunch orders having to be the same because otherwise that would become an issue. Or, that it was Siskel and Ebert, but they'd had a pact to switch it to Ebert and Siskel in 3 years. And these things, it's just like, they were obsessed with fairness. It felt like between the two of them, certainly.
Yes, they were always focused on that. The question everyone wants to know and asks a lot is, did they hate each other? Did they not get along? And it's a complicated answer. I mean, at some points they did hate each other. At other points they didn't. They grew to get along better. They grew to kind of like each other to an extent. They definitely kind of grew to respect each other, appreciate one another, maybe even love each other. But no matter how good the relationship got, they never lost that kind of competitive spirit. And one of the ways that manifested itself was, yes, in the ways that they would fret and focus on anything and everything where they felt like one or the other was getting a better deal, a better perk than they were, whether that was, the seat on the airplane, or who got to sit next to the host at a talk show, who got to pick what they were eating for lunch. Anything, could be a potential source of argument and conflict between them if there was any perception that one was not being treated as equally or fairly as the other.
These are two witty guys who neither one of them wants to back down. So I'm sure they were hilarious arguments. I think there were those outtakes that were in Life Itself, where you see the way they jab at each other and you go, I mean, they're just funny guys, and they knew how to needle each other, and it would take a lot of time, I imagine.
Take a lot of time to get them to do something, or to
get them to do something, and also to go, all right, and now we're going to review Waterworld. Can we move past this?
Right. Yes, yes, I do think that is very much true. But what is kind of interesting also is that, it's funny because you hear that, and you watch those outtakes, for example, and you read some of the stories and you wonder, well, were they hard to work with? Were they, divas? Were they difficult, quote unquote? And I think at times they could be a handful. I think that's probably a fair way to put it. But when I spoke to lots of people who worked on all the different iterations of the show before they were famous, after they were very famous, and they sort of pretty much uniformly all tell these stories about their fighting and arguing and all these with a kind of a love. It's like, yes, they could be a pain in the butt. Yes, they were obnoxious to each other. But I didn't really get the sense, for the most part, with maybe a couple of exceptions, that they were hard to work for, that they were mean bosses or anything like that. They're for the most part, their frustrations and rages were kind of aimed at each other, not at other people on the staff. And it seemed like the people who worked on the show loved working on the show and felt like it was this special, unique thing that really was valuable, performed a service, was entertaining, was this really special object in the film and TV landscape of the time that just happened to be hosted by these two guys that, to use that same word again, could sometimes, I don't think it's controversial to say this, they could be a little bit of a handful at times.
I think that's safe to say. Well, so you sort of mentioned in there that the show, and I guess I always knew this, but I maybe I didn't realize to the lengths to which it ended up going, is that it went through these different iterations. So it started on a very small, it was just a public, a PBS broadcast show out of Chicago that eventually got picked up around a lot of other PBS stations, and eventually ends up being with Disney. And I guess I was just wondering if you could kind of chart that exactly how it went. There's the Tribune Media years in there as well.
So it started as a show on WTTW, the Chicago PBS station, originally called Opening Soon ... at a theater near you. That was the very, very first version of the show. And within a year or two was changed to Sneak Previews. That was the show remained basically unchanged. The name was changed just because Opening Soon ... at a theater near you is not the snappiest title. It doesn't really look great or fit into a TV guide.
Sean Parker would say Sneak Previews is cleaner, I think.
It's cleaner, exactly. Yeah. Yes, and it 100% is. It's not the most accurate title because Sneak Previews we think of as like movie trailers, and that's not really what the show showed or did, but you understand it's in the movie world, and you are kind of giving the audience a sneak preview of the movies they're reviewing, but they're not really previewing them, they're reviewing them. But anyway, so that was the show until the early 1980s. I believe 1982 was when the show continued. Sneak Previews, the show, continued to exist into the 1990s, but Gene and Roger left the show, and they started their own show in syndication that was called, initially, At the Movies with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. That was at Tribune Entertainment, which was the parent company of the Chicago Tribune and WGN and a bunch of other, it was a conglomerate, a media conglomerate of the day. And that show was on the air with Gene and Roger for 4 years. And then when their contract was up, they jumped ship again to Disney, to Buena Vista Television. And that was the version of the show that was actually called Siskel and Ebert. Initially, for the first year, it was called Siskel and Ebert and the Movies. And then after a year, it was determined, by that point, these guys were so famous and sort of their names alone were enough to sell the show. And people were tuning in to watch Siskel and Ebert. The idea in the beginning of we're giving you the sneak preview of what's going on at your local theater, that kind of became less of the draw. The show was basically the same in every iteration, but I think the draw became less. We're showing you clips, we're telling you what's in the movie theater, because that information gradually became more readily available. There were more magazines, there was more coverage, there were other TV shows. Every time Gene and Roger left the show, the old show continued for a while with new hosts. So by the late 80s, there were 3 different movie review shows hosted by 3 different sets of critics, all being filmed in Chicago, which is a really weird and wild element of it. And they all existed simultaneously for a brief period, and then At the Movies went away, and then Sneak Previews went away a few years after that, and then eventually there was only one show again with Siskel and Ebert. But yeah, I even myself think of it as one show, Siskel and Ebert. That's what I always call it. That was what it was called when I was watching as a kid. But it really was 3 totally different shows that happened to be hosted by the same pair of guys and have essentially the same format all through those years, which was a period of just about 25 years.
And then the show doesn't sort of, until it evolves into its final form, that's when they finally adopt the thumbs up, thumbs down, which I think is obviously like if there is a lasting legacy outside of their obviously nuanced and lovely film criticism, it is thumbs up or thumbs down or 2 thumbs up. So I was very surprised to find that out, or at least I had never realized
that the thumbs were a later addition.
Were part of the final show. Yeah.
Well, actually, they were actually added in the second show. The Tribune show was the one where the thumbs were first introduced. The Sneak Previews show, Opening Soon and Sneak Previews, the rating system, which apparently took a lot of just coming up with this took a lot of work, was yes and no. That was the original rating system. So if they loved a movie, Star Wars, 2 yes votes for Star Wars, or if they disliked something, 2 no votes. Doesn't have quite the same ring. And what happened was when they left PBS for Tribune, as we just discussed, it was determined by lawyers or someone that just the concept of 2 people sitting and talking about movies was not a copyrightable idea. They could not be sued for leaving the show and doing essentially the same show in the same place. That they could get away with. But it was also determined that there were certain specific elements of the PBS show that if they tried to copy them, perhaps they might get themselves into a potentially actionable position. And one of those elements, kind of hilariously when you think about it, was like, well, they can't use yes and no ratings. You can't say yes and no, or you might get sued. So they had to come up with a new rating system. And that was when supposedly Roger was the one who first threw it out as an idea. What if we did thumbs up and thumbs down? And eventually, yeah, that really became one of the most famous aspects and most recognized aspects of the show. It became quoted in, every movie ad. If they gave it 2 thumbs up, odds were you were going to see that in a commercial, in a trailer, in a print ad. It became, for film criticism at the time, it became like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, really.
The certified fresh of its day, certainly.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which is that truly something insane to be like the concept of yes or no off the table. We cannot use it.
Don't do it. You'll get sued.
It'd be crazy. So I guess Obviously, you spent many hours of your life, even before this, watching Siskel and Ebert, and then I'm sure many more hours during the research of this. Can you could you describe what each guy's did they describe? Did you find any particular perspective that each guy brought to the movie, the way they would review these films, or certain things they liked or immediately kind of cooled to?
Well, they certainly did have different tastes, different preferences. And yeah, when you're watching so many episodes all in a row consecutively, like I did for the book, you start to pick up on that for sure. And they did also have kind of different approaches, even just to, the idea of film criticism and what their job was and how they should go about it. Gene Siskel always kind of looked at it as he was a reporter. Like that was what he did before he became the film critic at the Tribune. He was just a neighborhood news reporter at the Tribune. And he always said he looked at the job of being the film critic as not that different in concept. He's a reporter, and, if he was a reporter covering a fire, the news report would be about the fire. And for his job, as a film critic, the fire, if you will, was Say Anything, or, Benji the Hunted, or whatever movie it was that they were talking about. He was reporting on, here is what I saw, and here's what happened. Like, that was how he looked at his job. And when he would be asked, Ebert would sometimes say, well, he certainly also had a great background in journalism and actually had more experience as a journalist than Siskel did before the show and before they were working as rival print critics in Chicago. He would say that, like the job of a critic is more of almost like a teacher, that they're kind of educating the person that's reading or watching about the movie, what it's about, how it's about it, all those sorts of things. So they had kind of different approaches. And yes, they absolutely had very different tastes about different kinds of things. Now, certainly they agreed a lot of the time, and a lot of what we now think of as like the classics of that time period, they gave 2 thumbs up. They agreed on. And a lot of the famous bombs of that period, they gave 2 thumbs down to. But they would also disagree, sometimes about very popular movies. Sometimes they would agree about a movie in terms of the rating, but they would totally disagree about why it was 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down. And yes, they definitely had personal tastes and preferences, genres they liked better, genres they disliked more. Gene loved documentaries, not that Roger hated or disliked documentaries, but loved documentaries and hated science fiction films, and would often complain about science fiction films. They're too dark. They're too depressing. They paint a bleak portrait of the future. Where are the optimistic movies about the future? And Roger loved science fiction movies, grew up a sci-fi fan, had a sci-fi fanzine when he was a kid, and had no problem with dark science fiction movies. He did the commentary track on Dark City because he loved that movie so much. So that's just one example, and there's lots of them of, yes, different ways that they approached their job and approached different movies. And I think that was important. If they had approached every movie exactly the same way, what was the point of the show? You're getting a monotonous of an identical opinion. The show worked because they had different opinions, even when they sometimes agreed about whether a movie was good or bad. They would disagree sometimes quite vehemently about why it was good or bad. And that was, again, just very important to why the show worked and was entertaining.
You do a good job of illuminating exactly how both of them, they kind of approach film criticism in two equally valid but very different ways. Whereas I feel like, Siskel seemed to be comparing every new movie to the classics, to the best. That was his scale of like, is this comedy as funny as Bringing Up Baby? And Ebert seemed to have this very generous point of view, but it was essentially like, does this movie work on the level that it's trying to work at? And so that you could just see and consistently that there were those sorts of spats between them over that very concept, which I think is just so interesting. It carried throughout their entire time together.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And yeah, I do talk about that in the book, that they had their yardsticks, their measurements for what makes a good or a bad movie were totally different. And it's not something I ever thought about as a kid, but looking back now, what I'm seeing is, I'm getting sort of a 101 education on the basics of not just movies, but like movie criticism and thinking about movies and how do we evaluate them. Is a movie good if it stands up against the great films of all time? Or is it good if it has modest ambitions and it succeeds in achieving them? Does that make it a good movie? And as you said, like Gene and Roger had different opinions about that, the answer to that question, and they were quite strident about the way they saw it. Gene would say, when Roger would challenge him about, well, how can you compare this movie that's new and is coming out and it might be quite effective on its own terms? How can you say, well, it's okay, but it's no, if it was a war movie, well, it's okay, but it's no Platoon or something like that, and Gene would say, well, shouldn't every movie aspire to be a great movie? Why not compare them to a great movie? Isn't that what we're here to do? We're here to see great films. We want movies to reach for the stars, which, that's a fair point. But then Roger would say, but they're not all going to be Platoon or Apocalypse Now or whatever movie it is. Part of what makes those movies special is that they're great examples of this form. That's why we love those movies. And it's unrealistic to compare the latest movie to these lofty pillars of the cinematic canon, which is a good point as well. I mean, it's sort of interesting that I can see it from both sides, and I think probably listening, you might be able to see it from both sides. And that was again why they could have this endless, ongoing debate and argument, was that these are not easily resolvable issues. You could talk about that forever, potentially. And they talked about it for 25 years, essentially. So, yes, it was the conversations, even though they were never that long, they could sometimes take you into these interesting areas where they're not even necessarily reviewing a specific film. They're debating the fundamentals of criticism, or they're discussing spirituality or religion or politics or all these different kind of issues that, if anyone who loves movies will tell you, if you love movies, you love all these different things because all of these different things are reflected in movies.
Absolutely. And so you kind of talk in the book, or even just mentioned earlier, they become quite famous. Like, truly is it's kind of hard to even comprehend that there could be two film critics that were, this household name, this brand name and really reach that level of celebrity is kind of incredible. And they do it through, obviously the show, and you write, there's a whole chapter about their late night appearances, which are all great. And you should watch a 2-hour supercut on YouTube right now. If you haven't seen them on Letterman, it's incredible. But so what was it exactly? So they take this fame and then they use it to, go after kind of also what you're saying, they do special interest episodes. They champion small movies. It was so interesting to see how they use that fame.
Yeah. And I think, somebody asked me, I did a Q&A at a movie theater in Columbus, Ohio this week. And someone asked me, like, did they ever, were they ever nervous about doing shows like Letterman or Carson or these things where, did they worry that they were like straying too far from their mission? And the way I answered it was kind of what you're saying. It's like the advantage of doing those shows were it and becoming more famous or more recognizable was that it drew more eyeballs to the show. And on the show, they were able to direct people's attention to great movies, talented filmmakers, important issues that they thought were worth discussing and championing and moving a conversation forward about. I think they enjoyed doing a lot of those shows as well, and they were great on them. So why shouldn't they? But I do think that it was more than just, they liked being celebrities or they liked being famous. It was like the more famous they were and the more famous the show was, the more powerful the show was as this instrument to do what they always felt was the most important part of the show and the most rewarding part of the show, which was championing a little movie, like a Hoop Dreams or something like that, and helping to turn a film that might have otherwise not gotten much attention, not done that well at the box office, and trying to direct their audience to those movies. The bigger they got, the bigger the show got, the larger that audience theoretically became. And the more people that they could perhaps influence to vote with their dollars and go see a Hoop Dreams or a Gates of Heaven or any number of other movies like that.
To follow up on that very astute question from Columbus, Ohio, there is one time they were really nervous, and I love that story because it seems like it's almost when they were maybe at their absolute closest is right before they do Carson for the first time, and I was wondering if maybe you could just speak about that. It's just such a great story.
Yeah, I mean they were not great on television in the very beginning on their show, certainly, but at a certain point they became just a great TV act, and you could see that maybe almost more than on their show. Like they were just great as these presences that would do talk shows and other shows. And they were really good at bouncing off of each other. But they were probably most comfortable on a show like Letterman, where they were kind of with someone who's more of their peer age-wise, as opposed to someone like Johnny Carson, who they had watched for years as fans of The Tonight Show. And that they were kind of, they did, I think one of them said that the first time they were on The Tonight Show with Carson was when they kind of realized that they had made it, but also were sort of like, what the F are we doing here kind of thing, that they did not belong on The Tonight Show. They should be at home watching The Tonight Show. They were just two guys from Illinois, newspaper critics. What the heck are we doing on The Tonight Show? And yeah, I guess supposedly, as they told the story, the only time they ever hugged was basically out of pure terror backstage at The Tonight Show the first time they were doing the show with Johnny Carson. I think they had done the show already with like guest hosts previously, but the first time they kind of graduated to being guests on the show with Johnny, that was a huge deal for them. And they were so kind of freaked out and nervous that, supposedly they hugged backstage to try to summon the courage to get out there and do a good job. And they did enough of a good job that they were invited back many, many times. Yeah, all through Carson's run, and then they became favorites of Jay Leno's as well. They were on the show probably just as much or more with Jay Leno on The Tonight Show. Yeah,
it's just incredible how well their dynamic translated. It's really quite fun. It's always so fun to watch them do that. Well, so yeah, we kind of hit on this earlier. Is they use this cachet? They do these really fascinating episodes of the show that are kind of special interest things. Or I went back specifically and watched a bunch as I was reading the book, a bunch of their top 10 lists, and it was always just incredible to see. Again, you said documentaries, foreign films, really small independent films would always show up on this list. And I think it's just so interesting of how they, I think it's, or even one of their, a couple of their top 10 lists, I think like in 1989, Do the Right Thing is both their favorite movie of the year. And they kind of talk about at length how a lot of other critics found that film to be anti-white or, and how that was, and they talked about how that's such a ridiculous notion. And I think essentially it hit me, as I was also reading your book, is we were just so lucky that these were the guys who became the famous film critics, because they just were, they were prescient in some ways, they were thoughtful in so many ways, they were obviously progressive in so many ways, and I just wanted to maybe get your feelings on that as well.
Yeah, they were great champions of cinema, and they were, they were so honest too. I mean, I think that's the quality that I think was really valuable when you talk about that we were lucky that these were the guys. And maybe part of the reason they became the guys was for this reason, but we're also fortunate as well in that one could envision perhaps if they had never existed or if someone else had tried to do the show, that it could have been two guys who were schmoozy and they were guys who went to junkets and just wanted access and wanted to be famous just to be famous. And that's what they were in it for. And they would give every movie a pass and everything was great and nothing was bad. And that's not who they were. They were these Midwestern guys. They were honest. They were upfront. They were never part of the studio machine, although certainly the studio machine tried to, utilize their reviews and two thumbs up as much as they possibly could. They never kind of bowed to that sort of pressure. They always, whether you liked them or disliked them, whether you thought one had better reviews than the other, whether you agreed or disagreed with everything they said, I find it hard to believe that anyone could ever say that they thought that they were not being honest, that they were soft pedaling it, that they were telling the audience what a studio or a publicist or a director who was their buddy wanted you to hear. To some of the examples you were speaking of, exactly, like that's exactly what I mean. Like they were going to tell you what they thought, whether you agreed with them or not, whether other critics agreed with them or not, whether filmmakers they liked agreed with them or not. If Martin Scorsese, who was probably their joint favorite filmmaker, made a movie they thought was crummy, they would say so. They would say, The Color of Money, we don't like it. We're giving it 2 thumbs down. I love Color of Money. It's one of my favorite Scorsese movies, but they didn't like it. And they said, oh, well, 2 thumbs down. You know what I mean? Just because Martin Scorsese directed it and they loved Scorsese, that didn't mean anything. And they gave him an honest review. And that is when you say, like, we are lucky to have them. I think that's what I think of, is that they told it like it was, and they were, in Chicago plugging away, and they never left. I'm sure if they had wanted to, they could have moved to LA and made the show in LA. It probably would have been a lot easier from a TV production standpoint. But they didn't. They liked being in Chicago. Besides liking Chicago, I think they liked being away from all of that, where they could have a little more independence and they were able to speak freely. And yeah, I think that all of that was very important and absolutely was part of the reason that I think the people who watched the show, like me, it left such a big impression on.
I was thinking about how that Scorsese that of Color of Money is absolutely vicious, and yet they maintain a friendship. He comes back on the show years later. They were honest, and the real artists kind of appreciated that, which I think is kind of speaks well of them.
Yeah, I think there's a story in the book that maybe is from, I think maybe Richard Roper told me the story, but it was Ebert talking to Robert Altman, who was another one of their favorite directors, but they sometimes gave bad reviews to his movies. And I guess Altman and Ebert were hanging out and maybe at a film festival somewhere, and Ebert said something like, I'm still going to give your next movie, if I don't like it, I'm going to give it a bad review. And Altman said something to the effect of, if you didn't give the movies you didn't like a bad review, how would I know what the good ones meant? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm paraphrasing, but that was his sort of attitude, which, not every director probably would agree with that, but it's nice when a filmmaker gets it, and understands that not everything they make is going to be a success, or even if they think it's a success, it might not be to every audience member's taste or every critic's taste. These things are totally subjective.
So, and then also, what I found so interesting about the book is just beyond even the way that they sort of impacted the industry that they were, the movie film criticism, they sort of impacted the way the TV landscape in their wake. Obviously, you already referenced they had two shows left in their wake that also had critics come on and be discussing, but it sort of branches out into other fields as well, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean the show Siskel and Ebert ended, and even the kind of the continuations after Gene Siskel's passing all ended, and there isn't a show like it on television right now, at least not that I'm aware of in any sort of national syndicated or broadcast or cable context. But the influence of the show in and out of the world of movies, I think you could see everywhere in, things like podcasts and YouTube channels very clearly, or, in I would say they're, kind of a more evolved or expanded version of Siskel and Ebert. They're different in a lot of ways, but just the idea of, instead of criticism being a solitary thing, a one-way, a monologue, it becomes a conversation. You can find that influence in a lot of places where the film conversation lives today. And then you certainly can see, that whereas that show at the time was very unique especially in the mid 1970s in terms of presenting kind of honest, lively, real debate when that wasn't a big thing on television at the time. Now that's all of television because people have realized it's relatively inexpensive to do. And it's like an endlessly renewable topic. If you find a subject that people are passionate and divided about, like politics or sports, what have you, news, you can run that show forever. And there are shows now that have been on the air in those realms that have been on the air almost as long or maybe even longer than Siskel and Ebert was on the air. So yeah, I think they even though there isn't, a direct descendant of Siskel and Ebert on TV right now, that you can see the ways that it's very easy to see, I think, the ways that the show impacted film criticism and just the broader, TV landscape as well.
Yeah, something like Pardon the Interruption on ESPN is sports at the movies. Right. They're just both bald.
Right. Or the McLaughlin Group or Crossfire or whatever the show is now. Those are old examples, but I don't watch a lot of cable news, but I'm sure you could think of some examples, if you do, of shows that are like that, where you present people on opposing sides and it doesn't even really matter what they're talking about. The appeal is watching the argument.
Yes.
Yeah, and perhaps maybe that's part of the reason why there hasn't been another show like Siskel and Ebert about movies, is that maybe for some of the audience who was less interested in movies and they were more interested in the conversation and the debate and the argument, that format has been co-opted by these other things that maybe they're more interested in. Like if you were a Mets fan, you can, you can find people talking about New York sports that way on TV and certainly on talk radio and other places, online now for sure. So it's become the sort of thing where if you want the format, you can find it elsewhere. You have to really care about the movies to miss Siskel and Ebert, essentially.
And they would be killer podcasters if they had made it to the podcast. They'd be the best.
Yeah, I have said this before. Yeah, can you imagine the Siskel and Ebert podcast would have been incredible? Because the show, as much as I loved it, as much as it influenced me, as much as I still enjoy it, and rewatching the episodes for the show, I had a great time revisiting the show. It was not a chore; it was a pleasure to do that. The show was 30 minutes. It was 22 minutes plus commercials for a lot of its run. It was 4 reviews in that time, plus maybe a home video recommendation. The reviews were not that long. Even at their longest, one review might be 10 minutes, maybe 8 minutes. That's a long review for Siskel and Ebert. On a podcast, that's like the shortest podcast that's ever existed. A podcast is 30 minutes, it's an hour, it's 2 hours, it's 3 hours. I was listening to a podcast today and really enjoying it, and it was like 2 hours and 45 minutes. I did not finish it in one sitting, and it was about one movie. So it's a different world, and I do think I'm sure, I'm very confident in saying if they had wanted to do it, Siskel and Ebert could have done a podcast about movies, and it would have been the greatest podcast ever. I can't imagine it not being an incredible podcast. And it bums me out to think about it because we never got to hear it, unfortunately.
And it would be a podcast that wasn't hosted by two friends, so that would be kind of interesting. They don't have
it's true.
the competitive advantage.
Yeah, I mean, so many, and I listen to these podcasts. I'm a fan of these podcasts. They are different than Siskel and Ebert, not just in terms of the length, but in terms of the energy. Yeah, they're mostly hosted by people who like each other and they want to be there. And they, most of them, how did they start? Well, these two people who like hanging out and going to the movies started a podcast. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert did not like hanging out. They went to the movies together because that was their shared job. And even after they got closer, if they weren't going to a movie together for work, like a press screening, they weren't going to a movie to hang out. They didn't like say, hey, Gene, hey, Roger, you want to go to the movies this weekend? No, they never did that. They got closer. Maybe they socialized a little bit, but they were not like buddies. They never became buddies, chums, pals. They were partners. They were working very closely together, and they had a lot of respect for one another and did, kind of come to have this like love of one another in a way, but they weren't like just chilling together, and that's what you get on a lot of podcasts. And it is different. It's a different thing. There aren't, that I know of, there isn't a podcast where it's like these two critics hate each other and we force them to sit together and talk about this movie. Maybe that podcast should exist. Maybe someone should make that podcast. But if it doesn't exist, or if it does exist right now, I'm not aware of it.
And even with all that, obviously, like the Siskel and Ebert, as the public knew it, obviously ends in early 1999 with the sort of tragically young death of Siskel, Gene Siskel. And I felt like that chapter really, there was just so much about how obviously Siskel didn't want his illness to be public knowledge, and he kept it really tight within his family, and to the point where Roger was really sort of in the dark about it. And, he was planning to visit him, and instead, the day he was supposed to be visiting him in the hospital, he was his pallbearer, which this really hit me. It was just a very emotional, there's a lot of emotional heft to it. And I was wondering, did you have a similar sort of, was it emotional to go through that chapter?
Yeah, it was tough. It was very tough writing that chapter. It was tough getting, because I think a lot of the story of Siskel and Ebert is a fun story. And when I think of the show, I have such fond memories of it, and it evokes really important, happy memories for me. But the end was not, happy. And I think there's even a quote in there somewhere, maybe in that chapter, maybe in one of the other chapters, where I have every chapter starts with quotes from both Siskel and Ebert. And one of them from, I think, Ebert is something like, the only real ending is an unhappy one, is death, and any other ending is a false ending. So it was important to me to, even if the rest of the book was kind of fun and upbeat, I felt like I had to be honest and truthful in that chapter. And I don't know, I guess, you're sort of, you have to write these things dispassionately to some extent, but I guess it hit me when my wife was the person who was reading everything before, even before my editor or anybody else was seeing things. When I would finish a chapter, I would show it to her. And, I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. Like I would hand her the laptop, I would walk away, and then I would come back and see what she thought. And sometimes she would say, oh, I like this part, or you need to do more of this. Or I didn't understand this part. And she's a great audience for that, because, she likes movies, but she's a very casual moviegoer. She's not an obsessive nerd. So it was a great perspective to have, because I could have that kind of honest, more casual perspective on everything I was doing. And when I gave her that chapter to read, I came back in and she was crying, and she was like, this is brutal. It was that it kind of hit me then. And then doing the audiobook, which I recorded myself.
Sure.
Yeah, that chapter was not fun to read. It was hard to read that part. And I don't know that I got fully choked up, but it was difficult to read some of that stuff. And when you do kind of read it aloud, the weight of it and what happened, it's super sad. And I'm in my early 40s now. I was an 18-year-old kid when he passed away, when Gene Siskel passed away, and I was very upset. I was shocked because I didn't realize how sick he was. I was upset. But at 18, you think, well, he was an old person. He was 53. And, now being about 10 years younger than him, I'm horrified by that. It's so upsetting. It's more troubling now even than it was then. And it really, it's terrible. It's just a terrible, tragic thing. He just got ill and, and then passed away, and he had young kids. He had a lovely family. It's just awful.
I think you do a really, you handle that chapter really well. And it does, how do I want to put it? You don't sort of try to over glamorize. You don't overdo it. Really, it's just it's kind of there. It's what the story is. It's what the story it's a story I knew because having seen Life Itself and the great Ebert documentary and having read his memoir. But it was quite impactful. I think maybe it was the culmination of this book in so many ways of like, again, 25 years, where their relationship starts, you see where it ends. And Ebert's many tributes are just absolutely, he's a great writer. So those were great quotes to lean on. You also had that unbelievable quote and from that speech that Siskel gave at it was like a Chicago television banquet dinner. Some incredible stuff from that.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was lucky to find. I think a very brief clip of that might be in Life Itself, the documentary. But I was able to track down like that. It was a banquet for, I think it's the Chicago Museum of Broadcasting or something like that. Forgive me for not remembering the exact name of the museum. But I was able to, through my research, I figured out sort of this where they gave that speech and what it was from, and then found the museum and realized the museum had a copy of the whole speech, the whole night. Really, it's like the person there that I contacted originally gave me a clip that was maybe like 15 minutes. But it was like this benefit dinner for the museum where they were like the guests of honor. It was like a tribute to them. So I knew that it must be longer. And I think I followed up and said, like, is there any more of it? And she said, I think somewhere I have the full thing. Would you want me to digitize that and send it to you? And I was like, please send it to me. And that was, it's an incredible thing that I don't think has ever aired anywhere. And I don't know that anyone could see outside of that museum. And it's like, 90 minutes of them talking, telling stories, giving their memories of how the show started and different bumps in the road along the way. And that was a really incredibly valuable, because, unfortunately, neither one is with us for, getting their voices and their memories and their perspectives into the book. Documents like that tape became hugely important to not only getting them in there, but also being things that maybe if you are a Siskel and Ebert fan, maybe, you probably haven't seen all of these or heard all of these quotes or heard all of these stories before, because they all happened at this event that was, it wasn't televised. It was just, I guess, documented kind of for posterity by the museum.
Moving away from me, almost on the verge of tears here. I love the appendix at the back of the book. I think it's such a great way to, I think even you say it in the book, it's to get a little bit of criticism, your own criticism into the book and really talk about, because again, watching these top 10 lists, watching a bunch of these episodes that I went back and did, because they're all on YouTube, they're all incredible. Like you can have just an amazing night watching 6 episodes in a row and just be like, that was awesome. There's so many movies that they give positive reviews to that I've just, they haven't held in the sort of the public consciousness. And so I think that was just such a great way to kind of do that, is to put these movies in there. It's like a really fun homework assignment to go like track down these movies, that some of which I've seen, some I haven't. And it's like, what a great discovery. That's so much of what their show was about, was helping people discover things. And I think you did a great job of it there. How did that idea come to be, and what was it like putting it together?
Yeah, thanks. That idea was one of the few things that kind of evolved over the course of researching the book, whereas most of the book is pretty much what I envisioned and pitched originally. But as I was doing the research and watching all these episodes, hundreds of episodes, obviously I expected there to be movies I wouldn't have heard of, but I assumed that like when I would watch an episode and there would be 5 movies, I would have heard of 2 of them. I would have seen 3 or 4 of them, and maybe there'd be one random movie that I don't know or not familiar with, but it's 2 thumbs down. It's some middling, forgettable thing, and why would I know about this random junky movie? Of course, no one would remember this. But what surprised me was how many movies got 2 thumbs up and they would rave about, and I would go, well, I've never seen this, or even in some cases, I've never even heard of this movie. And at a certain point, I felt like, because the show, obviously the stories of them fighting and all that, it's great. And I love those stories too. And I absolutely felt a book about Siskel and Ebert needed that stuff. I did also feel like a book about Siskel and Ebert, these critics who were so important in the macro sense, and also just to me personally, I wanted there to be some sort of, if not film criticism, then at least a little bit of like film advocacy in the book somehow, some way. And that was where that idea came from, was kind of combining these things. It's like, let's do an appendix at the back of the Buried Treasures, which was a name for shows that they used to do where they would recommend kind of movies that had flopped in theaters. Let's do a appendix of Buried Treasures that are the movies that have never quite become the famous quote unquote classics of that era. And, you called it like fun homework. I think that's a kind of a nice way to put it. I mean, that was sort of what would happen to me, was I'm watching these episodes and then I want to watch these movies. And then I would track them down and watch them. And more often than not go, this is a great movie. This is a wonderful film. And so all of the movies that are in that appendix are, I focused mostly on what Gene and or Roger had to say about them, but they're all movies that I liked and agreed with them about. And so it was a way to, give people hopefully an opportunity to kind of continue, maybe in some small way, like continue the mission of Siskel and Ebert of drawing attention to these movies that people might otherwise not see. And if people like the book, that is great. And if people read the book and they get to the end and they're inspired to watch The Plot Against Harry or Monsieur Here or Back to the Beach or, one of these movies, and they like it, that would be about as good as a compliment as I could get. That was hopefully the goal with that section of the book, was get a little of that flavor of watching Siskel and Ebert and wanting to go out and watch things. That's hopefully, if I did my job right, that's what that appendix does for the reader.
Absolutely. And it's so funny you mentioned The Plot Against Harry, because obviously there's a new restoration going around.
It's kind of funny. A couple of the movies that were in there, just, because the book was finished, or basically finished like a year ago, and then you have to edit it and all the different things. But like just in the last year, The Plot Against Harry got restored and played in New York and LA, and another film that's in there, Household Saints, just had a restoration and played at the New York Film Festival, which is great. It's exciting. It's like, look, I mean, hopefully people read the book and then they actually, some of these movies have been very hard to see. So the fact that the timing is kind of nice in that way, maybe people will be able to see The Plot Against Harry, which is this tiny little movie that was kind of forgotten even before Siskel and Ebert found it, or talked about it at least. I don't know that they found it, but it basically was like a movie from the early 1970s that had kind of never gotten released at the time, and then finally got a little release, I believe, in the early 1990s, and they loved it and recommended it then. And then, it had a life then, but it is certainly not a movie that people talk about a whole lot these days. No offense to The Plot Against Harry, but lo and behold, here it is again. Yeah, it's in the book, and it is. I was so excited to see that it got played, I think, here in New York at Film Forum. And yeah, hopefully people have a chance to see it and some of the other movies that are in the appendix. I think that's great. I really hope people do get to see some of these movies because they're wonderful. They deserve to be remembered alongside the movies that are the classics, the acknowledged masterpieces of that 25-year period that the show is on the air.
It was a beautiful bit of symmetry or synergy, I should say. That movie, Plot Against Harry, again, like Lost in a Closet, never got released. I saw it at a theater right around the corner from my house, the America Cinematheque, which is a great organization out here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Played it. I came home. I was reading your book, and then also the YouTube recommended, here's their review, here's their top 10 list from that year, and they talk about it at length. And I was just like, what a lovely, just all three things at once, and it was great. It's a lovely, lovely, funny, sweet movie, and I'm glad I got to see it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I'll wrap up with this because again, we lose them both. Even Ebert, when he passes away, is relatively young, and there's another world in which even right now today, as Siskel himself sort of put it, they're both old men in a nursing home who are getting rolled in front of a camera and get to talk about movies, or I guess they're doing a podcast. Is there any movies in particular or any film in particular that you kind of wish we had their thoughts on since they've passed? I feel like there's so many. I would have loved to have seen, Ebert. I would have loved to see them go back and forth about this era, like the last 10 years of Scorsese. I think would be so interesting because obviously they were so invested in him, and it's such a different, he's doing the same things but in different ways, and I think that would have led to some interesting conversation. But is there anything in particular to you wish they had seen?
I mean, name a movie of the last 10 years or the last 20 years, 25 years since Siskel passed away. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, to me, it's great that these directors who they championed and were such fans of and really encouraging of, that they're still around, they're still making movies. To me, is really wonderful that we're still talking about Siskel and Ebert right now. And the people that they like to talk about, many of them are still here with us, fortunately, and still fortunately making the sorts of movies that Siskel and Ebert liked them to do. I think that is a really, it's lovely. And I think in some small way is a nice testament to them and their impact that some of the directors that they championed are still around and still going strong. I think that's fabulous. Yeah, someone like Errol Morris, who we didn't even really get, we didn't touch on until right now. Essentially we'll say he owes a career to them because they were so emphatic in their support of his earliest work. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. And you're exactly right in two ways here. Let me say you're right in two ways. One, it's amazing to see that these guys who they loved are still working. And two, you're exactly right in that really, it doesn't matter. Any particular film could lead to some pretty fascinating discussion between the two guys. It doesn't really matter. That was sort of the beauty of it, is that, it could be any odd release on a September Friday, and you'd say, well, that's the best discussion I've ever heard about that particular kind of movie. So, yeah, exactly.
They're special guys. I'd say thank you so much for joining me today, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about this with you. And let me just recommend to everyone again, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed the Movies Forever, by Matt Singer. It's going to be available in our Skylight Books Arts Annex, the cool older brother of our main store, where all the good movie books go. It's 1814 North Vermont, so definitely come by and grab it from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, man.
Oh, my pleasure. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.